What's up, guys? Welcome back to the show. I feel like it's been a little while since I've been here with you. I've missed you. I hope the feeling is mutual. Anyways, my guest today is Jean Epstein. Jean was the chief economist for the New York Stock Exchange. She was also the economics editor at Barron's from 93 to 2017. And more recently, he is the director and moderator of the Soho debates. You might have seen these on YouTube. This is where he usually pits either himself or two sides of a social issue or economic issue against each other, debate in a live audience, and of course throw it up on YouTube. Two that are of significant or of particular relevance to Bitcoiners would be the one between Peter Schiff and Eric Voorhees, and then the one between George Selgin and Safety and Amos. I presume many of you have seen those. If you haven't, they're worth a watch. In any case, I recently saw in November a debate that Jean did with Richard Wolff, and the debate was socialism versus free market capitalism. And Jean took that side, and Richard Wolff, who I was previously unaware of, apparently he's an eminent socialist scholar in the United States and a professor and author. He, of course, took the other side. I thought the debate was okay. I thought Richard's arguments were pretty horrible. This was my introduction to Jean, and after having seen the debate, I thought he might make for an interesting conversation. So I invited him on. He graciously accepted, and this is our discussion. It's about 2 hours and 20 minutes long. If you want to cut it up, the first hour is all about socialism versus capitalism, more or less, and the debate that he had with Richard Wolff. After the hour mark, we get into more Bitcoin-related and money-related issues. And of particular note, we talked about store of value. Jean's position is that money is not, nor should we want in our money it to serve as a store of value, but rather exclusively as a medium of exchange. And I pointed out to Jean that I felt that was a contradiction, and then explained my case for something like Bitcoin as a store of value. And we went back and forth on that for a while with a spirited conversation. And the last note I'll make is just in explaining to Jean how nodes operate. At the latter part of the interview, we were discussing sort of financial incentives, and I kind of said there was no direct financial incentives and kind of explained a little bit about how nodes work. But as soon as I finished, the call, I realized that I'm kind of explaining it in too narrow of a framework. Obviously, nodes are financially incentivized, or people are financially incentivized to run a node because it allows them to verify their transactions and thus minimize the risk of loss or fraudulent transactions, etc. So that part was left out. I wish I had put that in because I think Jean would have appreciated it. But nevertheless, I was focusing more on whether people could gain income from nodes. That was kind of the context of our conversation. Anyways, I know some Bitcoiners will be pulling their hair out at that point, so I wanted to make a note about it here. Anyways, that's all. I hope you enjoy the show.
Let's do it.
Well, Jean, I know it's a bit early in the morning, so thank you for joining me for a discussion today.
I wake up at 5:30 every morning, so it's not early for me.
Had a half day already. So Jean, I actually just to give you some context, I came across your work for the first time. I think last month you did a debate with Richard Wolff.
Yeah.
And I saw that video on YouTube because in the Bitcoin space, of course, there's lots of talk about libertarianism and free market capitalism and obviously a lot of critiques of socialism.
Yeah.
And I saw that debate, and I was struck. I was struck by the ego actually of Richard. I find that this is a very common thread among supporters of socialism, and I of course they don't admit that, and I think it's often concealed by a perceived sense of compassion or something like that. But I see a lot of ego in that, and so I guess we can just start off by you maybe introducing yourself, and then maybe giving your take on how that debate went, and then we can just take it wherever it goes from there.
Sure. Well, this is my second big debate, actually, with a socialist. A year ago, October, I had a debate with Bhaskar Sankara, who started Jacobin magazine. And with Bhaskar, it was a narrower issue having to do with freedom and socialism. With Richard, it was about prosperity, freedom, and even equality, all of those three issues. And I read Richard's book, Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism, and I did a deep dive into it in my presentation. My own background, I guess that's most relevant, which I always emphasize when I debate socialists, is that I came from that, let us say, intellectual depravity. It's not morally depraved necessarily to be a socialist if you have the right values, but if you do have the right values, then ultimately you've got to evolve. As I said, introducing myself in the debate with Richard as well as with Bhaskar, my own mother was a member of the Communist Party, card-carrying member of the Communist Party. So I grew up with communism and evolved into a democratic socialist, and then miraculously, perhaps, evolved into a libertarian. But in doing a deep dive into Richard's book, I was able to isolate the fact that he wants workers' self-directed enterprises. And my point has been for a long time that workers' self-directed enterprises, employees becoming their own employers, already exists, as Richard himself at times acknowledges. And its potential to flourish under capitalism is enormous if that's what workers want, if that's what people want. And so that was the thrust of my argument, that we can have that kind of socialism right away. That's something that I've known for decades. It's a new point that rather staggered Bhaskar, and that Richard mainly chose to ignore. The possibilities of worker-controlled enterprises, worker-owned enterprises are vast, given the fact that the lower half of the population accounts for 1/3 of all consumer spending, the bottom 4/5 for nearly 2/3, the enormous amount of money that labor union pension funds hold that could invest in these enterprises. But the embarrassing thing for people like Richard and people like Bhaskar is that that workers are unenthusiastic about these ideas, this way of working, and so they are going to resort to the iron fist of government. Now, speaking to your point about ego, indeed, I think Bhaskar, much younger than Richard, put up a better argument. At least he did try to argue with me in his own way. But whereas Richard went for the high ground, I was surprised after I summarized his book and after I talked about how the problems with the kind of socialism he wants are going to put freedom under siege and certainly prosperity under siege. Equality is another matter, and we could go into that. Mm-hmm. But at least 2 out of 3 are going to be severely compromised under Richard's vision of socialism. So I thought that perhaps he was going to respond by claiming that I was quoting his book out of context or equivocating in some way about what he really meant to write in that book. But speaking about your point about ego, he basically backed away from his own book when he got up to refute me, and continued with a kind of approach that you rightly say was kind of ego, was kind of narcissistic. He in his summary, for example, he's saying that the reason why he's winning the debate is that he gets so many invitations to speak about socialism. He said, I've gotten more invitations to speak about socialism in the past few years than in my entire career. Another reason why he felt he was winning the debate is that he said, and did you notice how often Gene said he agreed with me about certain issues? Well, I got up and when I did my summation, I said the reason Richard and I agree about so many issues is that we are both radicals, but we do want radical change. But Richard wants to march in the wrong direction. To deal with the problems that Richard and I agree about, we need more capitalism rather than less. And so it was, I won the debate according to Oxford style rules by more than 20 percentage points because Richard, somewhat to my dismay, turned out to be an easy mark. I say somewhat to my dismay because when I debated Bhaskar, a 29-year-old guy, and I'm twice as old, I was accused of, I was told, pick on somebody your own size. And so I took on Richard, who's a little older than I, a very learned guy who, of course, wants you to know immediately in his introductory remarks that he's got a BA from Harvard and a PhD from Yale. So I thought, well, finally, I'm taking on the great heavyweight in socialism. And I regret that I didn't emphasize this point in my summation, that I didn't say, hey, look, guys, this is the guy, because he's been called by Richard Wolff has been called by the New York Times perhaps the most eminent socialist in the country. Cornel West has called him, our greatest socialist. So as I said, this is the best that you're going to hear. I guess just to back up, also, I was just appalled that Richard could say, and we socialists have an advantage. We've learned from certain mistakes we made in the 20th century. Certain mistakes. I regretted saying, well, I did of course say in my rebuttal that the problems of that socialism that Richard mentions in the 20th century was that tens of millions of innocent people were killed. I thought that perhaps I'd turn up the temperature. I regret that I didn't by saying somewhat sarcastically, well, it was about 100 million lives taken from that 20th century experiment in socialism. If they undergo a tenfold improvement, I guess there'll only be 10 million lives taken on the next round. But I was criticized. Oddly enough, there's never a perfect performance when you debate somebody, and oddly enough, I was criticized for not turning up the rhetoric. Part of the reason why I wanted to sort of be nice to Richard and calm and agree with him when I could was that I was criticized for yelling at Bhaskar,
Right.
and that was definitely dumb. So basically, I'm happy with the way it was handled. I beat Bhaskar by 10 percentage points in Oxford style voting. Richard by 20 percentage points. So probably I took it was a better strategy that I took all in all.
Yeah. I actually took a little clip from the debate with Richard and I tweeted it out because it's and I'll address a couple of things that you just touched on, but for me it's remarkable to hear someone like that speak and the types of things they say. And I mean, how many times throughout history have we heard this is a new socialism? We have learned from the things of the past. I mean, and what the point that you made in I think both debates, which I watched, is that and we'll get into to what degree we're limited in the free market capitalism at the moment. And as you said, we should be marching in the other direction, not away from it. But these people seem to fail to recognize that if you choose to structure, if you feel that the current structure of an organization is so dictatorial, is so oppressive, and another one would work better, not just for the workers, but would be sustainable and maybe even more profitable, then you have the ability to structure your organization like that today. So why not, if it's so much better, and if everybody would so freely choose to engage in such an organization of, a more, for lack of a more all-encompassing term, a socialist type of organization, why are there not more of them? And then the other point is that, I think the framing of this debate is always the semantics really kind of muddy the waters. Yeah, we should really be. It shouldn't be socialism versus capitalism. Well, it should be freedom versus oppression, because a free market. Well, hear me out here, right? Okay. So a free market allows for choice by all the participants in the market. Right? So there's no one imposing anything. You get to do what you want to do. You get to sell your labor. You get to buy the products, whatever it is. In socialism, if there's something that is required of you that you don't want to participate in, you will be forced to do that. And that is, in my opinion, a form of oppression. It's imposing on your own free will. Yeah. Well, as you know, I made that point both times by talking about
by assuming on two levels. First of all, assuming that there really will be, the vote of the majority, participatory democracy, that it will be voting from the bottom up. We know that's really not going to happen in a complicated society, but I say let's even assume that. And then of course, I actually quoted Connor Friedersdorf, who's a sort of fellow traveler, who wrote in The Atlantic. Does this mean that we can't have contraceptives? We'll only have contraceptives if and only if a majority of workers says yes, or that we'll only have the Seoul Forum or Jacobin Magazine if and only if a majority of workers agrees to give them resources. So, of course, I touched that point, but then, of course, I said that there are not going to be enough hours in the day, and obviously we are not even going to be able to follow all the decisions that have to be made each day. So it's clearly going to come from the same elites that have ruled the previous socialisms. So I did make that point, but I balked initially when you said, John, that it shouldn't be socialism versus capitalism. I want to emphasize one point. There was a week after my debate, Intelligence Squared had a debate with Bhaskar and Richard Wolff, teamed up. And the resolution read, capitalism is a blessing. That was it. That the other side had to defend the idea that capitalism is a blessing. And my objection there, and why it went badly, is that unless you have a resolution that chooses between the two, then you're comparing capitalism with some sort of unknown ideal, some sort of vague utopia. And of course, Richard and Bhaskar were just there to just sort of dump on whatever goes wrong under capitalism, and no, it's not a blessing. And so you're putting capitalism on the defensive. Obviously, in the real world, we want to compare one thing with another. But speaking to your narrower point, freedom versus oppression, I do think that you must take into account that these debates by me were set up to get socialists to come. We at the Seoul Forum, that's the debate series I run, we gave discount tickets to subscribers to Jacobin Magazine. We gave Richard Wolff promo code to invite his followers. And so in both cases, we did something similar. So about 1/3 of the people in the audience were either socialists or very sympathetic to socialism. I wanted to talk to them. So you understand that I don't want to load the dice by saying it's freedom from oppression.
Of course,
I want to argue with them. I want to say that what you like, what you approve of, is going to put freedom under siege.
Sure.
So that's that. Okay, then you and I agree about basically how you frame it if you want to reach out to socialists, and so that's my main point. But of course, the burden, it's easy enough to make the argument that you've just made and that I've made, that freedom and prosperity will be under siege. In the case of prosperity, in the limited time available, I made the simple point that prosperity, even a lot of people don't even understand this insight, prosperity basically springs from innovation. If you don't have innovation, then if nothing changes, then if you turn the clock back to the year 1750, you just would have had more potbelly stoves and windmills and slow-moving sailing ships. You would have had more investment, people working harder, but you would not have had prosperity. You would have had pretty much the same old. And so it comes then from innovation, and innovation consists so often of what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. The creative destruction of the automobile, the creative destruction of productivity on the farm that drove 80% of the workers off the farm. It brings upheavals, and so clearly a tightly controlled socialist economy, controlled either by the majority, which of course is a dream, or controlled by elites who would vote on these things, they would pretty much protect special interests and choke off 95% or more of the innovative projects that they get applied to them. I pointed out Steve Jobs would not have gone to charm school, and he clearly now has upended about 10 different merchants that sell flashlights and other devices that his smartphone replaces. I don't carry a watch anymore because I've got my smartphone to tell me the time.
Sure.
So that's why innovation. That's why you would not get prosperity either. I didn't go for the old style point that there's a lot of disincentives to work under socialism. That too is true, but I think that the most important point is to talk about how it would choke off creative destruction.
Right, and that point you make about innovation is fundamentally driven by a freedom to be able to pursue your own self-interest, right? So people are in that way driven to find new ways. Whereas you said there's many examples of in the past where, these top-down ways of solving problems is typically just to throw more bodies at it, and it becomes such a complex structure that nothing gets innovated, and in fact it becomes less and less efficient. And this was actually a point, the point I made about ego. Obviously it's a multifaceted sort of thing, and a lot of times it's overt in the form of arrogance, or you can pick it up in the way that people speak, but in another way it's far more subtle. And this is the one that I think is most insidious today, because there are, as preaching to the choir, I know, but the market does automatically at basically no cost, matching the almost infinite wants and needs with limited resources. It's able to do that without anybody controlling that. But once you place that gargantuan task into the hands of a top-down structure, a la a government, and you say, well, we need to know what all the data inputs are in this market, and then we need to figure out, based on our biases or our morals or the voting public or whatever, how to distribute that most equitably, most fairly, most efficiently, most productively. That believing that that's possible, and believing that you can do it better than the emergent properties of the market, is, in my opinion, very egotistical as well.
That's a good insight. Absolutely. And of course, to put a fine point on it, it's not just that there really is no input-output table that can even put a radioactive isotope in the body of the economy as it exists at any moment in time.
Right.
Even then, you can't. It's almost impossible to command all of that data. However, even if you could, even if you're some computer nerd who believes that you can, it's always a look backward. So take any moment in time. I like to take 1750, since that really clears the air, or take 1950, or take 1970. The things that changed, the way in which the economy changed, the vision of a Bezos, of Jeff Bezos, or the vision of a Steve Jobs about how things can change in the way we do things, those things have to be tested in the market. And by the way, I would also want to emphasize that most of these visionaries fail. Most of these visions do not work out, and only the market ultimately can judge which visions will work out. And so the fundamental reason why it's egotistical is that nobody can really foresee the future. Nobody can foresee what will change or how it will change. It's only the experiment of the market that can ultimately answer that question. Although I want to turn, and you are quite right to talk about, of course, the ego of such people. I mean, it goes back to John Maynard Keynes and a whole lot of people, the economists who want to be at the tables of power and who want to help run the world. I mean, that urge, which I understand, I think I had that a little bit when I was in my 20s. That lack of humility and that zeal for power, I think warps mainstream economics. It's warped in other ways too. The fetish of mathematics, the idea that economics is a branch of mathematics, also warps it. But I want to back up and just make a side point about self-interest and ego, which relates in a way to Bitcoin. We're right to talk about, we're right to quote Adam Smith about appealing to the self-interest of people. And by the way, Adam Smith eschewed selfishness. he regarded selfishness as meaning something else, and that's been a problem I have with the Ayn Randian people, many of whom I like, but I did debate an Ayn Randian, Yaron Brook, at the Seoul Forum about the virtue of selfishness. No, we don't believe that selfishness is a virtue. We acknowledge that there are selfish and greedy people. It's hard to expunge. You and I are not moral crusaders, and there will always be selfish and greedy people in any economy. And the beauty of the market economy is it channels their selfishness and greed into productive ends. A pure market does. So that's good as well. But I think we also ought to emphasize that plenty of entrepreneurs had mixed emotions. Yeah, I guess they had some ego, but they were just visionaries. They wanted to bring something new to the market. If we think of all the personalities of some of these people, from most recently from Jeff Bezos and Steve Jobs, Sam Walton, Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, they were visionaries, and they might have been saintly visionaries for all we know in terms of their mix of emotions. So I think there too. I think that really, and now think of Satoshi. I mean, that whoever Satoshi is or was, he or she or it seems to be a person without ego, because otherwise he'd make himself known to us. But he chose to remain anonymous. He didn't want the personal credit for what he or she or it or they did. Wanted to be selfless in terms of making the contribution about the breakthrough of Bitcoin.
Right, and that's a point that a lot of people in the Bitcoin space really admire and hold up as something as a very important component of how this network was launched. In that he remained anonymous. Yeah. But just so, and we'll break into Bitcoin and money and that kind of stuff in a second. But I'm just curious from your perspective, because you have these debates and you're in New York and stuff like that. What do you attribute to what seems to be the rising popularity, at least intellectually? Because I think there may not be as much popularity or excitement for it in practice. But what do you believe is the reason for the rise in popularity of socialism in the United States and potentially in other parts of the world today?
Yeah, well, I've grappled with that, of course, impossible question. I begin by saying that I believe that certainly from what I observe in my own country, of course, I obviously read about what goes on in other countries, but there I'm wondering about my own feel or ability to understand other nationalities. I could almost turn the question on its head and ask, how do I account for the vast popularity of libertarianism in Brazil? The Students for Liberty is the biggest branch of Students for Liberty is in Brazil. Why Brazil? Why did it happen there? That's libertarianism. But I also think that domestically. To get back to the narrow part of the question, domestically, in this country, the popularity of socialism, I think, is skin deep. I think it may not last. People could flip pretty quickly. That's part of the reason why I wanted to have these debates with socialists. But of course, the easy answer and probably inadequate that I, as an economist, who has been devoting his career to following the ups and downs of the economy and interpreting the numbers, the easy answer that I can give is that young people were subjected to the unexpected trauma of the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. That's when they came of age. They saw many of their parents struggle. Then when they entered the job market, the slow recovery of 2010, 2011 buffeted them, and then unfortunately, because the mainstream can't figure out what causes recessions, they blamed it on capitalism, and so they went through traumatic times. And then so that made them susceptible to the blandishments of socialism. And an inadequate answer, but certainly looking back, I'm 75, so I was left leaning for sure in my 20s. I was part of the New Left movement. I demonstrated against the Democratic Convention in 1968. So I was part of that anger as well, and in a way, that anger is even harder to account for. Although, of course, in part, it's harder to account for. We were demonstrating against the Vietnam War that we were being asked to become cannon fodder in America's war. But prior to that, there was a New Left movement, and even there, it's harder to account for why the popularity of socialism then. Although I will say that the New Left movement that I was a part of in the 1960s did become a sort of self-help movement. It did set the example of believing that we have to start the revolution now and create communes, go to the country, create communal farms, all of that stuff. That happened a great deal. It all failed, but at least it was an honest attempt to live the revolution right away under capitalism, which is what I've been preaching to the socialists. I also just want to sandwich in a post-mortem. I don't know if I discovered that Richard Wolff did a little talk in which he was discussing my debate with him, in which he actually recalled a series of incidents. In fact, the only things he recounted about our exchange were things that simply did not take place. He said that I enjoyed pointing out to him that Hitler was a socialist. I happen to believe that probably you can make that argument that National Socialism, as it was called, was basically another form of socialism. However, I didn't mention Hitler at all. He recalled that he asked me a question to which I smiled, and nothing of that sort happened. And so, I only discovered this, but I listened to Dave Smith's Part of the Problem podcast, and Dave Smith had been sent this video in which Richard is talking about our debate, and it was just jaw-dropping. Everything he recounted simply didn't take place in our debate. And of course, I tweeted this a couple of times. I said, please listen to the debate, and you'll find that Richard is living in a dream world. The only thing I could interpret is that he did feel a little bit bruised, and I guess he kept mumbling to himself, well, how did it really go? And he turned around in his mind that these things transpired during the debate that simply didn't happen. So I mean that's sort of an ultimate commentary on the fantasy world in which Richard Wolff lives. But I going back to your question, that's the best answer I can give. There were economic traumas over the last 10 years, which I think induced in our young people especially a sort of skin-deep loyalty to socialism that I think is probably not going to last.
Yeah, I agree with much of that. Yeah. And on the point about Richard Wolff, I mean, I think that's a characteristic, right? It is a characteristic that I see in a lot of people that support socialism. And there's obviously many factors. There's but perhaps not as well informed about, all of these different economics theories or areas of thought. But there's a naivete, and there's many other things. But there's all, as we mentioned, ego. But I also think, delusion is a big part of it, and defined as not being able to see things for the way they are. Now, we all struggle with that. That's, nobody sees with absolute clarity. But I tend to see a greater degree of that, or a lack of that, rather, when I observe socialists speak. And I think that's why I commend your work, and the work that I do in the podcast, and everybody who's talking about trying to bring more clarity, more information to this subject matter, because I feel like today, part of the reason for the popularity of socialism is because people are misinterpreting what we currently have as pure capitalism, and they're saying, well, clearly this isn't working. Look at my family, look at the price of goods, look at my wages, look at all these things. My quality of life is not where I think it should be, and darn it, we're in a capitalist system, so capitalism must be bad, and that by default means socialism must be good. So I'm a advocate of socialism now. And that is that is such a well, that is delusional. I don't think that's a very clear appraisal or assessment of what's going on. And so I think bringing some more clear and focused and calm language to these things, as well as the requisite information so that you can understand them more fully, is definitely very important, because we need people to understand what we currently have now, and this is what we'll break into next, is I would say now we have I've heard the term corporate socialism before, but the government, I tweeted this out yesterday. and I used a little bit of exaggeration, a license, let's say, but I said, how can you call a system in which the government is one half of every or controls the value of one half of every transaction, free market capitalism? And I'm
Yeah.
referring to the fact that the government, controls the currency. So how
Mhm.
could you describe that? I mean, that's very
Mhm.
socialist in my mind, because the
Mhm.
government is party to every single transaction.
Yeah.
And so
Mhm.
I think we need to reframe it and put different language around these arguments. Now, I know that's difficult
Mhm.
because this is
Yeah.
often such an emotionally charged debate that it's really hard to get people to, shelve their emotions for at least a little while and try to understand positions and try to delve into these subjects, more deeply than maybe they have before. But
Mhm. Mhm.
what I wanted to break into next is, and this will probably segue us into money and Bitcoin, is
Before I segue, can I comment on what you just said?
yes, please.
I mean, I want to. Of course, you're right that we have to talk about what kind of capitalism we have. The most striking thing about, as I mentioned, it's not just that Richard was could not hear my arguments when I made them when we encountered each other, but of course, I was just personally appalled that he could he could have the lunacy to describe for people a debate that existed on podcast and could be accessed on video to expose the fact that he was completely mischaracterizing what I said. The worst of it was, the most ridiculous part was not just the Hitler part, but he said that Gene Epstein kept telling him that capitalism is perfect. That free market capitalism operates perfectly. And that, of course, is what we're up against, because I guess, and of course, I didn't say anything about perfection, and I'm an Austrian. I believe that that markets are going to fail us constantly, even under free market capitalism, and a market failure is 99% of the time an entrepreneurial opportunity, but often an entrepreneurial opportunity that goes unexploited. And so we Austrians know that that's not true of the market. But Richard was getting this, of course, this word perfect that I didn't use, and characterizing and saying that I did use it from his encounter with, with the mainstream and with the notion of perfect competition in microeconomics. And so we have that to deal with. We have to point out that no, there's institutions fail us all the time, but in the realm of economics, government institutions fail us most of the time, almost all the time. Market institutions fail us less often. And so it went to that extreme with Richard. And that's where I almost felt, we had a friendly conversation before the debate started. And I sort of felt personally betrayed by this lunatic. He's putting, but again, I just kept insisting, listen to the debate. You'll find that he's living in a dream world about what I actually said. That was perfection. But then getting to your point about crony capitalism, I think that the system has been actually doing a lot better than the mainstream characterizes it. I do think that they exaggerate inflation, and that in fact most people are living better. We are living in a not right now, certainly. After the trauma of the Great Recession, we are doing better. But I'm only saying, though, that the balance of statements that we have to make between my stating at the debate, what I said at the debate was that even the flawed capitalism we have now, heavily distorted by government intervention on behalf of the powerful, is preferable by far to the socialism that Richard is advocating. And I think that it's important for libertarians like you and me to have to insist on that point. I think we sound like we equivocate a little bit too much if we say, well, I don't like what goes on either, and I'm not going to defend it. No, I did have to defend even our flawed system in terms of prosperity and freedom against the socialism that Richard was advocating. But while at the same time, the delicate balance, beginning to suggest the ways in which we need more capitalism and not less, the ways in which the crony capitalist system, or as I called it, the crapitalist system, a contraction of crony capitalism, does distort what we've got. But while I obviously endorse your tweet, I would say that we should never be caught saying that what we have is so bad that we don't prefer it to socialism. But I was criticized. Again, obviously, anybody can give you Monday morning quarterbacking, and I actually appreciated the criticisms because, of course, I can only plead in response that I had only a certain number of minutes to make my case. But I was criticized, for example, in not on the one hand advocating that capitalism is a blessing. That's really a wonderful thing. I emphasize that it's flawed, and so I was criticized for that. And then on the other hand, I was told, well, you seem to be having it both ways. On the one hand, you say this system is preferable. On the other hand, you're saying it's not so preferable because of crony capitalism. So I responded to the one critic by saying, suppose you go to a doctor and the doctor says, well, you're healthier than most people, but you do need treatment for these various ailments. So
Sure.
The doctor's not contradicting himself. He's just making two statements that are perfectly compatible with each other. But you and I might, given your drift, you and I, however, my final point to make, you and I might disagree about one thing. I do still claim that because it's palpable and factual that people really are living better than 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that there really has been material progress under our current system. I do believe that on balance, we have the crony capitalist system is not dominant. And I think that there's a tendency on the part of my fellow Austrians often to underestimate the resiliency of free market forces, even under the system we currently have.
Yeah, well, I can assure you that my followers on Twitter will be will not take my recent tweet as supporting socialism in any way or shitting on capitalism. I'm very much I'm very critical of socialism very often on Twitter, but and I agree with much of what you just said. And to me, it's just a matter of saying, what do we have and how can it be better? I mean, that's just a sensible way of looking at anything. It doesn't matter if it's your health, if it's a business, if it's the economy. And one of the troubling issues, of course, is that socialists always say we've never had true socialism, and that's why we need to try it again. I still need to figure out how to frame it, because I'm basically saying we've never had, or in pockets perhaps, but we don't currently have true free market capitalism, and that would be better. So we're stuck in this kind of philosophical quagmire, because we're both kind of saying we've never had it as we're envisioning it, and therefore we need to try it. But
I don't think it's a quagmire. Again, I would only say that again, that's why I took a deep dive into Richard's plan. The ideal, which Basco and the rest of them love. They want worker control. They want sort of bottom up control. I pointed out that there was a huge movement in the 1980s about this. They are well-intentioned people. For the most part, they don't like authoritarianism. For the most part, they renounce the brutality of the conventional socialism. But with good intentions, they want worker ownership and control. So again, that's out there. That is true socialism, and that's where I pointed out that even if you can imagine participatory democracy, the mantra of the New Left in the 1960s, then that will simply mean the tyranny of the majority. I played with that point. I said it's a fantasy, but let's even assume the fantasy becomes reality. Do we really want? I mentioned Muslim prayer rugs and mosques. Do we really want 51% of the people to tell us what to do? Go with that fantasy. That is true socialism. So I think it's easy enough to drive a stake through that heart.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. And just to capstone on your what you were saying previously is I agree, of course, that we're in a better situation now, despite the heavy burden that let's say free markets are having to bear as a result of the level of government intervention in the economy and economies around the world. We're definitely better off. Nobody's going to argue with that. What I wonder is, at what cost has our current situation come, and what has been taken off the table, as like what greater prosperity might there have been had we been under a different system? But we could
Oh yeah, well, no. I think that if you do a back of the envelope calculation, just putting it in terms of just kind of conventional growth figures, there had been moments in time. There's a moment when there was an 8% GDP growth. I think that there could be 7% economic growth every year, which would mean a doubling of output every 10 years. It could be double and triple the unimaginable economic progress. If you, I mean, I could go into that, but if you just think in terms of the creativity that would be unleashed and the dead weight of government removed, then of course it would be just extraordinary. So I latch upon a number of 7%, double every 10 years. I think that's easily achievable.
Yeah.
But
Well, let's break into that because in
yeah,
my opinion,
yeah,
because people will always ask, well, if this is the capitalism, the quote unquote capitalism, free markets that we currently have,
yeah.
what happened? Why don't we have the one that you're telling me about? Why
Well,
don't we have that? And
well,
in my opinion,
yeah.
it's all about the money. Who controls
Hmm.
the money in an
Hmm.
economy? And there's been
Yeah.
periods throughout history where a harder, sounder money has been used. Obviously, gold, let's say 1870s to early 1900s,
Hmm.
where this is an era that's generally touted as a hard money, sound money era. And look at all the great things that occurred during that time.
Hmm.
However, because of the attributes of the money used, of gold, it still remained, even though it was far better than fiat experiments in the past or other forms of money used, its attributes it was still susceptible to co-option or coercion or change or things of this nature. So for me, it's all about the money. And this will obviously lead us into a talk about Bitcoin. But
Hmm. Yeah.
what's your opinion? Why do we have the capitalism that we have now, and why has it run amok? Why has it devolved into the cronyism and the capitalism that you've articulated?
Well, there's the I mean, the sort of dialectic. I liked an essay by Hans Hermann Hoppe, uh, who was a Misesian. Not everybody likes that essay, but I think it was kind of clever. In which he begins by saying that he endorses a lot of the vision of Karl Marx, except that Karl Marx doesn't put it right. That there basically is the dialectic between tyranny and freedom, and the intellectuals, the smart people, are invariably seduced by the blandishments of power, and so they preach on behalf of the powerful, and the special interests that inevitably arise in any society uh, uh, are difficult to expose because, for the most part, the intellectuals work for them. I mean, one of the obvious flaws of our economy in the 1800s was that banks were forbidden to merge. I don't know if you know that simple problem that a bank, it was called unit banking, a bank that issued money and credit in a agricultural community, let's say that's dominated by the output of soybeans, would in a market system logically merge with other banks because merged banks that might be in other regions that would be lending money where they turn out wheat or cotton, or where they turn out manufactured goods. Those banks that would merge would obviously have diversified risk and be much more powerful. So those merging tendencies would have been very natural in the free market, but there were constant bank failures because local banks, in line with politicians, in line with with rationalizers who worked for them, liked the idea of keeping out competition, and so that was part of the reason why we did have boom and bust. A good part of the reason why we had boom and bust in the late 1800s, and what led to the Panic of '07 and the Panic of '07, which led to the creation of the Federal Reserve. Again, there were at that time, by the way, when the Federal Reserve was created, a lot of people who understood what reforms should be instituted in order to mute booms and busts, but they were overruled by powerful bankers who could buy intellectuals. And so it's a constant battle between the powerful, who usually have the smart, high IQ people on their side. A guy I admire, Michael Munger, who's an political economist, actually, he has argued that the crony capitalist system is hopeless to reform. We'll never be able to fight it. It's endemic to capitalism. Why? It's endemic because the usual argument that it benefits a few and hurts the many, but it hurts the many in ways that the many can't quite feel or be aware of. And so the typical example is the sugar industry, the sugar lobby. They keep out the imports of sugar. They maintain price controls. So it benefits them narrowly, and it hurts us only by a few cents on the dollar. So we don't fight it. So Michael Munger argues, well, it's hopeless to fight these crony capitalists. Well, I think it's absurd. It's not hopeless to fight them once we point out to people the simple and palpable fact that the whole swarm of these people are by forcing us by intervening in the market are stealing from us. One would you could have said it's hopeless to abolish slavery. I mean, the fight for freedom takes a long time. Sometimes it takes hundreds of years. But if we look back in time, there has been relative tangible progress. We do live in a freer world than the world was a couple hundred years ago, to at least a few hundred years ago. And so I do think it's hopeful, but I don't think it's surprising that the blandishments of tyranny, especially to the intellectuals, are very mouth-watering to them. And so we still live in a world in which the mainstream economists and the mainstream intellectuals are on the side of power. I was taught this by a left-winger named Noam Chomsky. American Power and the New Mandarins was the name of the book he wrote about the Vietnam War. He exposed for me, sort of the scales fell from my eyes, he exposed for me that the political scientists, the political professors who were running teach-ins about the Vietnam War were basically assumed basically accepted the assumptions of American imperialism, that the American government owns the world, and because it owns the world, it has a right to do what it wants in the world. And so I understood this right away from him about politics, and then studying economics, I began to recognize that this exists in economics as well. The average economist dreams of becoming chairman of the Federal Reserve or chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. But we do have Austrian economics. We do have the insights of the free market with which to fight them. And I think that there is some chance, possibly even a good chance, that eventually we'll win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is... this reminds me of a discussion I had recently at a Christmas party, I think last weekend, which obviously such occasions aren't the greatest for these types of conversations. But the argument I was making was pretty simple. Because there's a lot of not hate, but people are very much against billionaires and large companies and stuff these days. And I was making the point that if someone becomes a billionaire in a true free market, it's because they provided a product or service that the market deemed worth a certain amount. So what they receive is perfectly equitable because they brought value to the market and the market valued it and freely gave them their resources in exchange for it. The problem is that in a true free market, that should be the apex of market success. As many market participants as possible value your product and service, and you reap the rewards of that. There's no higher aim. But if you have a centralized power structure over top of that, then there is a higher aim. Then you're incentivized to even go further. So if you have a successful business, then it's not just getting as much as you can out of the market, but there's a point at which you say, I could get even more if I lobby, if I get regulations and laws changed, and that I can push my power and influence that I derive from the market in the form of wealth, and I can push it through the power structure to gain even more unfair, return. And so, my argument was that, billionaires and large corporations and that kind of stuff are an absolute good in a free market. Where it goes awry is when they have a honeypot of a centralized power structure to get them to magnify their power and influence once they establish some of it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course,
Mm-hmm.
this is counter to what socialists are actually claiming, because they want that power structure and that centralized government to be even larger, and thus
Mm-hmm.
you're increasing the honeypot by whatever means people ultimately access it. But
Mm-hmm.
you're making that issue potentially worse, and so that was the
Yeah.
argument that I was making.
Well, you're quite right. Yeah, no, yeah, I could, I guess a few comments about that. I mean, at the most extreme, I mean, I know, I won't mention his name, even though he probably won't mind. An eminent sort of classical liberal has talked about how he's got a daughter in the real estate business, and he's observed close up that it seems like, in the real estate business, about the last thing you have to know about is how to put up a building, or how to run a building. The main thing you bring to the party is how to work the political machine.
Right.
It's that warped. That's the real value of being in the real estate market, because the real estate market is so filled with cartels that it's even before you get anywhere in the market. You talk about how you build a business and then you turn to politics, as indeed does tend to happen. I mean, certainly Amazon, for example, has some blemishes on its record. But for the most part, obviously Bezos' billions. It's almost a joke when you talk about how if Bezos is hoarding all these billions and he should give them away. It's all based upon on the valuation of a company that has made comparatively little in profit.
Mm-hmm.
That he keeps building this empire. He now wants to sell clothing and food, and he said you can't be a merchant of the world unless you go into those fields as well. He's just got this vision that we all respond to. I do want to just comment as a sidelight on one of my hobby horses, which is that I've been persuaded by, in particular, for example, Friedrich Hayek's book, the Mirage of Social Justice, about the idea of pushing, not, you didn't use that word, but it sometimes comes up, the idea that billions are merited, the idea of the meritocracy, the idea that the distribution of income reflects merit. Well, I commented on this in the course of criticizing Thomas Piketty's book called Capital in the 21st century, is what it was. A book, of course, about the corruption of capitalism, and I used that as my example. I said, Piketty, this has been a doorstop bestseller globally. Piketty has probably made millions of euros from the sale of this book. I think the book is absolutely without merit, but I can't begrudge him his millions. This was a free exchange on the free market. My point is only that you and I don't want to be gulled into saying that all income is merited. Merit is not the issue. It's just capitalist acts between consenting adults. Mm-hmm. If you and I can imagine, how would we like to see more money and more investment in certain things that we personally like? Are there many things brought out on the market that are very successful that are of no value at all to us, like Piketty's book? Of course. Mm-hmm. So we're not pushing the idea of a meritocracy. We're just pushing the idea that you respect the actions of people in terms of what they want to buy. It's their rights. Even the idea of good, that this is doing good, you might say it's doing bad. Look, if you're somebody who's very upset about the fact that Barnes and Noble is now like, one-fifth the size of what it used to be, that I personally think it's upsetting. I enjoyed going into the Barnes and Noble stores, but I'm part of the problem. I buy my books from Amazon for the most part, and so but if you think it's terrible that these bricks and mortar stores have been are now collapsing, then create an alternative. Then let's have a call to financial arms and create the alternative of bookstores that are bricks and mortar. My point is, again, only that we don't want to be caught in the trap of saying it's good or meritocratic. It's just people exercising their own rights in the free market. But going back to your point, indeed, that's to put a finer point on what you just said at this Christmas party. It's really that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren really are pushing the ugliest side of crony capitalism. That's what their plans are going to result in. That's what Medicare for all is going to become.
Yeah, and it's funny. It's
Yeah,
obvious. This was the person I was speaking with. They were extremely adamantly for Bernie Sanders, and this was the
yeah,
genesis of the argument. But
yeah,
one of the things you just said that that always comes up in my mind
yeah.
is that people fail to recognize that the most well, this could be misconstrued because in
Oh,
the current system,
yes,
there's different. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
no, no,
yeah.
go
In the
ahead.
current system, there's different ways to exercise power in the market, let's say. But
Yeah,
I people fail to recognize that it's the way that they allocate their resources, i.e., how they spend their money, that is the greatest vote that they can cast. And
yeah,
so often in these arguments, people want to have their cake and eat it too. You want
yeah,
your iPhone and you want your Frappuccino and you want all this kind of stuff,
yeah,
but you don't want to allow the people that provide you those services to freely do so. It's
yeah,
it's
yeah,
some sort of a gap or a dissonance between having the lifestyle that you have and that you want, and some ideological or philosophical construction that you have
yeah,
in your mind of how things could be better.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
but Gina, we're getting on a little bit in time, so I want to
Oh,
break
okay.
into. I
Have
mean,
we got?
I'm totally fine, but I want to be respectful of your time.
No, 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 okay. No, no. Once you get me started,
Okay,
it's hard to
perfect.
shut me up. So go ahead.
Perfect.
But if, yeah,
So, like I was saying a few minutes ago, I think one of the primary reasons why this has run amok is because it's been corruptible. And I
yeah,
think that is because of the type of money that has been used. I'd
yeah,
like to get your
sure,
take
sure.
on the well, perhaps you could
Mhm,
define money for me, and then
mhm,
talk about its importance, and then we can break into how you think the type of money currently used has corrupted the system,
mhm.
and then maybe we can talk
Okay.
about Bitcoin.
Well, sure. Okay. And I guess I could give you the 65-minute version of that because I have a lot to say about it, but I'll try to keep it brief.
That was a bit of a long
I-
question. I apologize.
Well, don't
Yeah.
no need to apologize. I actually do think that that while I learn all the time from people like you who will always know a lot more about the technicalities of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin in particular than but I do feel that oftentimes they should learn a little bit from me, who has been steeped in the Austrian tradition about money and understands what money is all about. One of my hobby horses is that, to answer your question, what is money? Money is simply a medium of exchange. It's simply a medium by which you and I exchange goods and services. And that may sound lame to say that's all it is, but part of what I bridle at is that then people start talking about money as a store of value,
Mm-hmm.
which is something they got from the mainstream, and I think it leads them into sort of odd rabbit holes. Money is in an advanced economy. It's not a store of value. Nobody in his right mind would store value by just putting but through Bitcoin. I'm talking about storing value, but you could speculate in Bitcoin at this point, or you could speculate in gold, because these things are not as yet the medium of exchange. These things like Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies are clearly used to some small degree as mediums of exchange, but they're increasing in value because there is a bet being made that ultimately they could become the dominant medium of exchange. But that's not a storing value. That's a speculation, which is perfectly honorable. Speculators are always very important in any market. But when we store value, if Bitcoin were money, say, which I would welcome the day when Bitcoin does become the medium of exchange, then what will happen, of course, is that nobody's going to speculate in Bitcoin or treat it as a store of value. In an advanced economy, we store value by buying stocks and bonds, or we sometimes speculate in commodities, which are usually volatile in price, or we speculate in land, which can appreciate in price. That's the way in which, or we buy a property, buy a building. That's how we store value in an advanced economy. Only only the fanatics think in terms of storing value by putting it in terms of money. That's ridiculous. And I make that point only because I do think that it leads to confusion. Now, how did money come to be? I think it's important for people to appreciate what Mises called the regression theorem. That's Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian economist. Money has value because of what it could buy yesterday. We accept a certain amount of money because we know that yesterday it had purchasing power. And money had value yesterday because of what it could buy the day before. And then money the day before that had value because of what it could buy the day before that. And so, as Mises said, putting a fine point on it, we're now regressing back in time to the day when money came into being. And when money came into being, it clearly was some kind of a commodity, gold or seashells or silver. It was a commodity that had value as a commodity, and then it began to be used as money. And gold is serviceable as money. Gold was a good money, the best alternative we had. But I think that arguably Bitcoin is a better money. I actually had a little bit of a problem early on with Bitcoin because I couldn't quite square it with the regression theorem, but I don't think it's very difficult. I did notice that, at least from what I read, that Satoshi in some of his writings seemed to have some awareness of the Misesian insight about money. And then once Bitcoin could buy those famous pizza pies, it began to become money. And now, of course, the dollar became money because the dollar was built on gold. That it connected to gold, which was the money before that. And so that's how the dollar became money. And this is how, by and large, as my friend Robert Murphy points out, the Bitcoin has sort of built on the dollar or built on other currencies to become understandable as money. And on balance, if you total up the pluses and minuses of gold as money and total up the pluses and minuses of Bitcoin as money, I think that Bitcoin has the best chance of becoming money. It's a more serviceable money than gold was. And even though gold did have its uses, and gold obviously was a huge step forward, but gold, of course, evolved quickly, evolved naturally. Now, the final insight is that money is a network commodity. By that I mean that the talk at times that I sometimes hear from crypto enthusiasts is that, isn't it wonderful? We have so many different cryptocurrencies competing with each other. This is the kind of world we'll live in. Well, it's not the kind of world we'll live in, most likely, because most of us want to hold, what we want to do is, that's why gold became dominant money, because people want to hold the kind of money and use the kind of money that other people use. That we want to use the most popular money because we want the money we use to have the maximum amount of purchasing power. And purchasing power means that we want the popular money. So the popular money then will feed on its own popularity. And that's why eventually what happened was that gold became the dominant money. And similarly, what will happen again is the network for probably Bitcoin will win out, or whichever one will win out. If we can abolish government's fiat money, then there will be one money, possibly two monies. Mises wrote that maybe silver and gold would have been the monies. Maybe there would have been two monies, but maybe there would have been only one. Never more than two in the world. Now, why does government want to get into the money business? Why is that? Indeed, I agree with you. Why is that the worst thing? As I have said, I would prefer that government dominate the shoe industry rather than dominate the money industry. The shoes will pinch, but we can probably have underground that will make shoes. We can walk around in sandals. We can get by. But when government dominates the money supply, that's when all kinds of bad things happen. That's when booms and busts occur. But why did government want to dominate the money supply? Historically, the kings wanted to fight their wars. They had to finance those wars. They could finance the wars through taxing and borrowing, but that's not a good way to finance a war. Sorry.
Yep.
That's not an easy way to finance a war. The easiest way to finance the war is to seize the people's money decide that money has to be run by the government and then debase the currency and then print money in order to finance your wars. So that's how World War I was financed. That's how World War II was financed. And that's why it's pernicious. And that's why left-wingers who object to the imperialism of government should understand that freeing up a free market in money is the most powerful way in which we can combat America's wars, our government's wars. And finally, I guess, hopefully brought this in by less than 60 minutes. My hope is that that when the fiscal crisis of the state begins to bite, which I think will be in about 15 years, maybe there's a chance that Bitcoin can become the dominant money. The debt of the U.S. government is piling up. I think that in about 15 to 20 years, the temptation for them to really print money, to let the printing presses roll in order to finance their debt, could lead to the instability of the dollar, and the instability of the dollar, just as in the 1970s and into the early 80s, when double-digit inflation was running rampant before we had Bitcoin, gold began to soar in value as a refuge from the dollar. I think that very conceivably this could happen in 15 to 20 years when the fiscal crisis of the state begins to bite and there could be a turn toward Bitcoin. That's the reason why. But of course, timing is impossible in terms of these things. I think that Bitcoin is potentially a good bet for the future. It has some chance of soaring in value to $1 million per Bitcoin, to $2 million per Bitcoin if it became money. And therefore, I think it's wise to allocate a portion of his personal resources to accumulating Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with and understand much of what you said. There's one part I'd like to break into though. So sure. If you'll permit me for a moment to share my opinion, and then I'll come.
You're running the show.
No, but what I'm saying is it may be a bit long-winded, and then I'll come to a question and I'll throw it back to you because it's not super clear in my mind. And I'm
talking about being long-winded. You're talking about so you go ahead, John.
Okay, thanks, Gene. Sure. So. Bitcoin is definitely, it's a paradigm shift in my mind. And it's something that's very difficult for a lot of people to understand. The idea of digital scarcity, even money itself is something that a lot of people haven't really thought of and obviously don't fully understand. So I think we're in this sort of time when it's even possible that pre-existing rules or understandings about these things are susceptible to either gross or slight change in understandings. And so the first part right now, let's say, just for the sake of this discussion, that Bitcoin does become the global money in this term that Bitcoiners use called hyper-Bitcoinization, where Bitcoin becomes the standard all around the world.
Hyper? Okay.
Right, hyper-Bitcoinization, yeah.
Okay.
And so right now, we would be in the kind of monetization phase of that, where the money is flowing in and people are basically, trading in their respective currencies to get a portion of their wealth in Bitcoin. And in the future, right, when everything is transacted in Bitcoin, ultimately, then the growth in the value or in the price of Bitcoin will probably somewhat approximate the growth of the economic growth. Right, when everything is transacted. So, let me get this one out, and then you get me with your response.
Sure. I'm taking notes. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So right now, of course, in the early days of that process, there's a lot of speculative gain to be derived if you guess correctly, right? Because the price is going to have to adjust to account for all the economic activity that's flooding in, and for which has to be represented ultimately by Bitcoin. So right now, speculative phase. But I want to go back to the medium of exchange, the store of value component, because when we invest money, right, we're looking for yield of some kind, right? Whether it's you're investing in a startup, high risk, or you're investing in bonds or something like that, you're looking for some kind of yield. And I think what a lot of people in the Bitcoin community think about money is that, of course, it is a medium of exchange and it is a unit of account, but it also is a store of value. But they may not all happen.
It's a speculation, John, but go
Hold
ahead.
on, Gene, hold on.
What do you,
They may not all happen at the same time, right? So different phases of the monetization of the money, you may get different use cases for it. And so
well, right now it's a speculation, right?
right, right,
Exactly.
right.
Okay.
And
Not a
so
store of value. But go ahead.
and so in my opinion, the demand for money is a very interesting thing to dig into, but ultimately
Yeah.
I think the attributes of anything really, but in this case we're talking about money, the attributes of the money dictate its demand, as for money, sorry. So whether we take gold or we take fiat currency, some of the attributes may be its scarcity. It's which is a limitation on how much can be created, for example, or
Yeah.
how can it be functionally used in exchange? Can it be easily sent? Can it be easily stored? Can it be safely stored? All of these
Yeah.
things are the different attributes for which people get to assess and say, as a result of those attributes, I value this money as whatever. And now, therefore, I'm willing to pay whatever price for it, or I'm not willing to pay for whatever price for it.
Yeah.
And so in that context, I think ultimately when it is fully monetized, if that should be the case,
Yeah.
that I think Bitcoin, because of its scarcity, will be should be in my mind a strong store of value. If I'm looking for yield beyond that, if I'm looking for an investment return of some kind, then maybe I'll look at another option. But in my opinion, one of the services, let's say, that money should be, is to store value, not to gain value, not to gain income, not to gain yield, but a something so that your excess resources, your excess capacity that you generate via your work that you want to save for later, that's what money is for, is to keep that in a container that doesn't leak, let's say, just to use a metaphor. And so that's not the case right now, obviously, with Bitcoin. But I think whether we're talking about how gold was historically used or how Bitcoin may be used in the future, I think that's a aspect of money that people are demanding. And I think that is a large part of the reason why the market is valuing something like Bitcoin, because it has the attributes that will allow it to be a store of value in the future. Now, a couple other things on top of that.
I'm in pain because you constantly use that phrase, John.
I know.
I do want to educate you, John.
I'm triggering you right now, Gene.
I want to be able to correct you, John.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. Give me one more second.
Sure.
So one other one other thing is that if there's two more things, then I'll give it back to you. One is if money is not a store of value, then what value are we exchanging? If I'm going to buy a house from somebody, if I'm going to buy a donut from somebody, if that money is not storing value, then why would they make that exchange with me? Because obviously what they have, they're valuing to some degree, whether it required their work or resources or whatever. So does not the money have to contain value in order to be a medium of exchange? Because what you're exchanging is value. And my final question is, how much of the value of a money is derived from the cost to produce it? Because what we see today is obviously today, let's say the cost to produce a Federal Reserve note is 5 cents, but they get to sell it onto the market or use it in the market for $1, right? And this is called seigniorage or seigniorage. But gold there's a tremendous cost to producing it and creating it and bringing it to market. Mm-hmm. So in your mind, how much of the value of a money is derived from the cost to produce it rather than its attributes that make it useful or functional in the market? Go for it, Gene.
Yeah, good. Okay, fine. All right. I'm glad you laid all that out, John, because this is, you and I have agreed about everything, almost everything so far. And of course, those people who've been intrepid enough to listen to us talk have said, these guys are just stroking each other. But but by and large, I think, of course, obviously, we've been supplementing each other. Hopefully, it's been a useful conversation. But right now, John, now you've done it. You've gone off the deep end, and you're a brilliant guy. So I need to correct you. Okay, listen carefully. Number one, the first point to bear in mind is that what is when Satoshi brought out Bitcoin, he was fully aware of the fact that others had been there before him. I don't even, he might have been familiar with Friedrich Hayek's book, The Denationalization of Money. Friedrich Hayek wanted a private money, and and he said it could develop. And then when he wrote this book, Murray Rothbard, who's also an Austrian, he wrote a nice little satire, and he said the problem with it is that I could bring out Rothbards as money, and I could be very honest and once people use Rothbards as money, they could trust me not to inflate the money supply, because obviously there's a huge temptation to do that, because after all, they're money. So I just have to print it. That's what government does. That's why governments, of course, wax and wane with printing. That's why, of course, the mainstream has learned its lesson a little bit. You can't inflate the money supply too much, because if you do, then the money becomes worthless, which of course happened in the 1920s in Weimar Germany. So, but then Satoshi came along, and what he then his big breakthrough was, of course, the very point about scarcity. Money has to be scarce. And the reason, getting to your cost issue, there is no direct relationship between cost and value, but the cost of mining gold, the relatively high cost of mining gold, assured us that it was very difficult to debase the gold. It was the amount of gold mining in the world that can be done can only increase the gold supply by about 1 or 2% a year, maybe 3%, no more than that. And so, and by the way, if let's say there were a technological breakthrough and the cost of mining gold plummeted by 99%, then that might be a problem. Because, by the way, there's more gold in the ocean, I've been told, than there is gold already been mined. So if we can mine it from the ocean at no cost, imagine some kind of technological breakthrough, then gold is no longer going to be money.
Right.
That was the problem in the market. You had to have something. It had to have the attribute of scarcity. And so the cost of mining it made it scarce. So that's where the cost goes in. Cost does not drive value, but high cost can determine scarcity. Now, obviously, Satoshi's breakthrough did not have anything directly to do with cost. It had to do with the 21 million ounces, the locked box, the fact that there could never be any more than 21 million 21 million units of Bitcoin out there. So that was his breakthrough. Now, and so that's where scarcity enters in. Unless there is an assurance that the money is scarce, then we're not going to use it. We won't use it. We won't hold it, because we're constantly worried that somebody is going to print a whole lot of it, and prices will soar, and what we're holding is going to plummet in value. So therefore, the supply has to be limited. And Satoshi drew a line in the sand. That's what's valuable about it. Now, getting to your store of value point, again, John, if you want to be one of those lunatics, forgive me for saying that, but if you want to be one of those lunatics in a world in which Bitcoin is money, by the way, in a world in which Bitcoin is money, there will be falling prices, falling wages nominally. So that it is true that if you hold Bitcoin, then let's say that that output is increasing by 6% a year, 7% a year. Then prices are going to fall by 7% a year. Bitcoin is going to appreciate by 7% a year. But if you want to hold Bitcoin and think that that's your way of storing value, fine. But people who are not lunatics are also going to notice that in a functioning market economy, there will invariably be many companies that offer a great deal of stability, that borrow money at an interest rate of, let's say, 2% or 3%, that that issue stock that yields in dividends 2 to 3%, or that issues stock that has very good record of capital gains of 3 or 4%. And so if you then take your Bitcoin that's going to appreciate by 7%, and then take that Bitcoin and convert it to a bond that on top of that is earning 3%, then you have, in simple mathematics, a 10% annual return rather than a 7% annual return. Now, that is a no-brainer, John. That is a no-brainer. Nobody, except for a certain lunatic fringe, is going to store his value only in money when the low-hanging fruit is out there, returning 3% easily enough on top of that 7%. Because then obviously, if the Bitcoin is then invested in the dividend yielding stock or the interest yielding bond, and you sell it in 10 years, then you'll convert it back into money. You'll get the complete appreciation of the money supply, the 7% annual return on the Bitcoin, plus the 3% compounded is going to make you far richer than John Vallis, who thought that this was the best way to keep his money in Bitcoin. So I'm only trying to point out that the store of value statement is just infantile in an advanced industrial economy. Now, then you ask the question, why will money have any value? It gets back to what I said about the simplicity of people. The only reason, what does the dollar have? The dollar costs practically nothing to manufacture. It's more expensive to put out Bitcoin. So does it have what the heck? It's basically on computer. The dollars, we basically buy things with our credit cards on computer. But of course, to the extent that we have the paper money that we use, then it's obviously very cheap to manufacture. The reason why it has value and why obviously it could lose all value if inflation goes into double digits or triple digits, it's simply that, as I said, yesterday, we are all simple people. Yesterday it could buy something. It had value yesterday. We know from visceral experience that it bought a lot of things yesterday. You get $1,000, you get $100. You have a general idea in your mind of what it could buy, not because you're some seer, not because you're some brilliant Satoshi-like forecaster or another version of John Vallis. It's because of what it could buy yesterday and what it could buy the day before. What it could buy. It regresses back in time. And Bitcoin, you have to start it going. And as Mises said, it originates in a commodity. Bitcoin, probably you could say it originated in perception, it originated in the dollar. It's already being used as a medium of exchange. And as the conversion happens, we've kickstarted it. It's already buying things yesterday. It's already buying things the day before. And so it's all value is subjective. Value is not based on cost. It's all subjective, and money gets going because of what it could buy yesterday. That's the only value it has as a medium of exchange. Now, I'm not denying that John Vallis could start his John Vallis fund and say, hey, look, we don't buy stocks and bonds. That's for capitalists. What we do is we store our value in Bitcoin, and that appreciates by 7% a year. So that's fine. That could exist. I would say it's going to become very unpopular once the Gene Epstein fund starts up and offers a 10% return, compounded on top of Bitcoin. You're not going to be able to compete, John. But if you want the John Vallis lame brain store of value. I'm sorry, John. You get my point, so I'll shut up now. I think I've touched all your points, John. I'm only saying the store of value fetish is just silly. We are now, you know what this arises from, John? Too many Bitcoin people, I was about to use another word, but they've read those dumb money and banking textbooks. And the money and banking textbooks were written by these sort of lame brain mainstream economists who like to elaborate on all the purposes of money, store of value, all that bullshit. So they got that on the brain. And then very possibly they think that the word speculation is a pejorative. They think it's not respectable. acceptable to speculate? Well, obviously it is. Speculators in land, speculators in wheat, and speculators in gold and in crude oil, all of those people serve a very important role. And similarly, speculators in Bitcoin serve an important role as well. So it's a very respectable thing to speculate in Bitcoin being the future money of the future medium of exchange. And that's what it's all about right now. I recommend speculating in Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So John, are you willing to admit that I'm right and you've made a couple of errors?
I'm not convinced, Gene. I'm not convinced. So let me respond.
Let's put this to Oxford style vote with you on this. Go ahead, John.
And also, I'll stand up for Bitcoiners. I think they are the sum of that.
I know.
For
Bitcoiners.
But they're very much on the store of value side of this debate.
I know. Mm-hmm. They're very much on it.
Yeah. So what I said, I'm going to apologize to them on your behalf, Gene, for using such pejoratives, and just tell them that I think John, they're right on with their assessment of store of value.
I only insulted you, John.
Well, I forgive you for that too, Gene.
I didn't insult the Bitcoin.
We all know that such things indicate weakness of argument, if anything.
I only said, thank you. Fair enough. That's a low blow, but a justified one. My point is only that they probably have read too many money and banking textbooks, and they probably don't respect the word speculation. I guess it's an ugly word in this society. They are speculators, and speculation, as I said, they are very honorable what they're doing. I think we should all speculate in Bitcoin, not of course with all your money, because timing on speculating in Bitcoin is almost an impossible thing. I put it at 10 to 15 years from now. Could happen sooner, could happen later. Mm-hmm. But so therefore, that's some of it. So I've endorsed Bitcoin completely. I'm just using Austrian words.
Yeah,
that's all.
And I'm sure you're familiar with this as well. But a lot of people in the Bitcoin community are very much fans and students of the Austrian school. And I would say that Bitcoiners don't see speculation as a bad thing whatsoever. In fact, they're very much understanding of the phase that we're in, and very much want to bennet from the speculation on Bitcoin.
But John, let me ask you one question. Though.
All right. Then I'm going to respond.
Let me just corner you and ask John.
Yeah,
sure. Are you really saying, as I've said, by the way, an interesting thing about Bitcoin is that an objection. I did have a debate on Bitcoin between George Selgin, very smart free market economist, and Safdie Ammous. I had another one between Eric Voorhees and Peter Schiff. And that earlier one has gotten over 600,000 views. The Peter Schiff talked about gold having intrinsic value. Nothing has intrinsic value. But George Selgin's problem was that labor wages are going to fall in nominal terms. And I think he's just hung up. Everything, prices and wages are going to fall in nominal terms. Therefore, it is true that if you go with my scenario, that output is going to increase by about 7% a year. Then approximately Bitcoin is going to be worth 7% more. But my narrow question to you, John, is that I call you up. I'm a broker, and I say, I've got two funds. One of them you just do store of value, quote unquote, in Bitcoin. The other one is that I can put your Bitcoin into a whole basket. I can put them into the latter day S&P 500, or I can put your money into very safe bonds that pay 3% on top of that, and that if you want me to give your money back in 10 years, on the one hand, you can make 10% compounded for 10 years if you put the Bitcoin into stocks. The very safe stocks, the very safe bonds that have virtually no chance of default, or if there is some default, it will still mean the return will be close to 3% a year. So that will be 10% or 7% if it's just a Bitcoin fund. Which one would you choose, John? That's the question, John. Answer it.
That is a question, and that would.
Well, answer my question, John.
I will answer your question, Gene. Sure. But that would very much depend on my circumstances and what I was looking for. But if I was to respond, Gene, and say, I don't want to play the markets. I don't want to take on that risk. All I want to do is work my daily job, and then whatever excess I have, I want to squirrel it away so in 10 years I can do whatever the hell I want with it. But I don't trust any company. I don't trust any government. I just want to make sure that my money is there for me when I get older.
John, you've loaded this up with a whole lot of crazy assumptions. In the world in which Bitcoin grows by 7% a year, John, reliably, more or less reliably. By the way, there's always a risk there. We don't know how much it's going to appreciate by.
Right.
John,
So we got to
I'm
measure the risk between
John,
these
John,
things.
John, in a word, yeah, fine. John,
Gene.
again, John, in the way,
Gene.
John, what you don't get is that obviously the other part of it is obviously the those who market bonds. The healthy part of it, by the way, is that those people who want to put their money in a mattress are going to be able to compete. The only way for capitalists to get investment is to offer a very attractive risk-adjusted return. And again, you've loaded it up with government. Government would be by and large abolished, John, because this is a world of Bitcoin.
I agree.
So you are not, okay. So all I'm trying to say, John, is that the vast majority of people will understand that this has a track record. These are very safe companies. They've been around for years. The chances of one of them defaulting is remote. If one does, the other 92, because we've diversified for you, if you're a very risk-averse person, is going to be such that they're selling bonds or you're putting it in some kind of secure bank. The vast majority of people are going to know that institutions are going to have to offer very credible risk-adjusted returns. And so if everyone is going to say that these are way too risky, then they're just going to up the interest rate that they're going to offer. That's what they're going to do. The point is that if you respect a free market, then you understand that there are many institutions that will have a huge incentive to offer attractive risk-adjusted returns. And if John Vallis, who I guess is so risk averse that he wants to put it in a mattress, I respect you, John. I'm only trying to point out that it's unrealistic when you look at the world in which there are a whole lot of people who will incur some risk, and then again on top of that, there are a whole lot of people who will recognize, who are very conservative, but who will respect institutions that can offer them decent risk-adjusted returns. Capitalism will function. You are almost assuming, John, that nobody's going to invest in anything, but obviously people will invest. By the way, there's another complication. People ask me if prices are falling, then how are capitalists ever going to invest at all? Well, capitalists will invest because they invest the spreads. Factors of production will be bought at a discount to price expectations. You are almost positing, John, a capitalism that isn't even going to function because nobody will want to invest. Obviously, a vast number of people will want to invest. What we will offer to them is the huge assortment of very safe investments that will offer a rate of return, and those that are riskier that will offer a much higher rate of return.
Right.
That's all.
Yeah. But I think so. What I would respond in that and say, no, capitalism will still function. Now, in a sound money system, we may be a little bit more conservative with how we invest money, and I think we see in the markets today with all this loose and free money, we see maybe a lot of irresponsible investing. But what I would say is that sure, I'll take 50% of my capital, 60, 70, 80, whatever it is, and put it in more risky investments all along the spectrum. But maybe I want to take 10 or 20 or 30 and keep it in the thing that I think is most risk-free way of preserving my capital. Right. Okay. And so it's not a one or the other. We're operating on a spectrum here. And so what I would let me respond to a couple of your points here.
Sure. Yeah.
Going way back right now, we were talking about, I asked what's the relationship between the cost to produce money and its value? And you said there's no direct relation between the two, to which I would agree. But I would say that the cost to produce it determines its scarcity, as you said, with gold
Precisely.
or with Bitcoin or anything,
right.
And its level of scarcity, its degree of scarcity, because scarcity is obviously on a spectrum, represented in the popularized stock-to-flow model. But that scarcity is valued in the market for money. So I'm going to value a money that is more scarce, that has a higher stock-to-flow than one that is less scarce. U.S. dollar versus gold, gold versus Bitcoin, whatever.
Precisely. That's why Bitcoin has an advantage.
Right. So in that way, the cost is definitely relevant to how it becomes valued in the market. Because
I take it you're underscoring my point, John. You're saying the cost, the higher cost. But although I should interrupt and only say that Satoshi sort of finessed it. The cost of mining Bitcoin is one thing. However, the 21 million ounce limit is something different, not directly related to cost, and so that's part of it as well. But indeed, cost. You're only elaborating on my point about the relationship between cost and scarcity. But go ahead.
Right. So I'm just saying that's my initial point about why people value money based on its attributes. The scarcity being one of those attributes as a result of value, and the scarcity derived from the cost. That's all I'm clarifying here.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
So the other thing I think that might be going on, and I'm sure you'll disagree with this, so give me a second to get it out. But it may be semantic, right? I'm seeing two things here. Yeah. I want a risk-free way of storing my value, and then I want ways in which I can derive yield or invest my money and be richer as a result of it. So I want those two things. Maybe you're saying that's not possible purely, or maybe you're saying that is best done via just less risky products on the spectrum. I'm saying in an ideal world, the attribute, I want something that's going to be a risk-free way of preserving capital, another one of growing my capital. So risk-free, and store of value to me is about confidence. And it goes back to risk. How confident am I that this thing is not going to go away, it's not going to go down, it's not going to, that's what it's all about. And that's why people are so, adamant and highly regard Bitcoin's scarcity, both derived from its technical cap on 21 million and because of the cost to produce it. Because it gives them the confidence that the value won't be eroded. They're not looking for yield outside of the speculative phase. Right now they are. Sorry. But what their expectation of the future is that won't be, people are trying to get rich on Bitcoin right now because they think they're early in seeing the emergence of a new paradigm shifting money on the world, right? And so if they're correct, and if in 20 years Bitcoin is the global standard, then that speculative investment would have been correct. They'll make money because the price is going to adjust higher to accommodate all the new demand that's going to come in the next 20 years. But I've never met a Bitcoiner who thinks that in 20 years or in a world in which Bitcoin is the standard, that it will be a good investment to grow your wealth. At that time, it will be a means of preserving the wealth that you have, and then obviously using it as a form of exchange when you want goods and services in a market. So that's in all my discussions with Bitcoiners and my own feelings on it, is that at that time the speculative component of it will be over. You'll have made or lost your money as a result of doing so, and it will simply be money, and money will be used as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. Because if you're not exchanging value, right, the money has to contain value, and as you say, value is subjective, and all the things we've already discussed go into valuing it in a subjective manner, its cost, its attributes, etc.
Having to do with the regression theorem, John. See, I think
I get the regression theorem. I get the regression theorem.
That's key. That's key. It's key. The main thing that, of course, that you and I have to recognize is that probably it's unfortunate. The average IQ of the Bitcoiner community is probably way above average, and the point is, stupid people like me have got to try to explain why we use money. We use it because of the regression theorem, because it's just the simple visceral fact that it could buy something yesterday, and that's key to the understanding about how it's going to be accepted universally by ordinary people with low IQs.
But that regresses back to its original creation, right? The regression theorem, the cost of originally creating. Let's go all the way back and since it was seashells, whatever.
But that's right. But the point is that the average person who used gold or uses dollars or will use Bitcoin is not necessarily going to be an historical scholar. Sure. The only thing he knows is that yesterday it could buy things. That's all I'm saying. But I want to speak to your point. First of all, you and I I have, again, when you mentioned semantics, I just think it's unfortunate that we have to use the term store of value. But in a way, in a way, we're having a semantic argument. Certainly, the distrust. I think the other reason why you use store of value is because the distrust of fiat currencies is a very healthy one, and obviously, you got to be a little bit silly if you're going to store value in fiat currencies. But certainly in the world in which you and I are describing, Bitcoin will appreciate in value. So in that sense, you could say it's a store of value. So I'm giving ground there, John. But I only want to make one. I only want to make one point about the hyper competitiveness and the hyper entrepreneurship of the financial institutions. I'm only trying to tell you that that in particular there will be, first of all, a very healthy competition. That's why we're the 7% appreciation that I'm saying Bitcoin. Obviously that's a generality. That's just in relation to output, and won't be 7% a year, but it will appreciate in value if you just hold it. I think it's healthy because it will force financial institutions to be able to offer interest returns to the risk averse that will give them a tangible advantage, and they will have to compete for that. Just bear in mind, John, that don't underestimate the entrepreneurship of finance. What will happen is that John Vallis is going to get a call from an institution that's going to say, we put our money in short-term instruments, in commercial paper. Commercial paper that is diversified to the 100 most stable companies in the world, and they have a sort of a 1% default rate every year. And so let's shave 1% off the average return on that commercial paper, and what we can offer you is a liquid account, because anytime you want the money, we can very quickly convert it, because this is like 30-day commercial paper, 60-day commercial paper that we're invested in. And again, John, don't bring government in, because Bitcoin is ruling. Government, if it's a minarchist state or an anarchist, government is out of the money business. And so we have relative stability. And so we can offer you a rate of return over and above your Bitcoin. And this will prove to be very advantageous to you because it'll be of a highly liquid account. All I'm trying to say is
I'll
that
do that for some. I'll do that for some.
Okay,
for sure.
Okay. All right. Where again, we're not keeping score, and I appreciate your intelligent responses, John. I'm sorry if I've insulted you in any way. and the Bitcoin community, I think you're great. But the point is that you have said, hey, look, 70% invested, 30%, and then you say, okay, you're saying, look, you'll keep a little bit in the mattress. Probably, I'll give ground and say, look, the mattress argument, that's what I disdainfully call the store of value. There will be, I like the mattress effect of Bitcoin because it will mean that it will empower the consumer of financial products. It will mean that, look, if you don't give me a decent enough very low risk rate of return in this commercial paper, I'm just going to keep it in the mattress. I'm going to keep it in the safe deposit box. I'm going to keep it in my computer because that's Bitcoin. So that's very valuable. But but given that your percentage split, John, has now been diminishing, I think you've at least recognized that you probably will store value. You may even store a fair amount of value in this commercial paper. Therefore, I would prefer to say that it's really just what the one thing we did not talk about, which is that as the Austrians have pointed out, by and large, people do not want to hold money. That's actually their negative statement. You don't really want to hold money because money doesn't give you any return. Now, of course, it would give you a return to somebody. It gives you less of a return than you could get if you had it in commercial paper. So why do we hold money? Only because of uncertainty. Because as Rothbard in particular pointed out, if you could imagine a world in which you can predict your transactions 100% exactly, that's of course what they argue. But if you, of course, well, at least with dollars that depreciate, that if you could predict your transactions by 100%, then you might well want to keep it in very low risk commercial paper. And you say, well, the moment it expires on that hour, then I'm going to make this purchase. and that purchase, there would be a tendency not to hold any money at all if we didn't live in a world of uncertainty. So I do think that series of insights about the nature of money, which so goes against the mainstream. The mainstream is so dumb. The mainstream is so dumb that if you're reading a textbook, you might ask yourself, now is the chapter on money. And what is the chapter of money beginning with? It's beginning with the Federal Reserve, the central bank. That these people are so out of it that they begin with a government institution as our key insight into the nature of money, and they work backwards from there. I mean, that's just crazy. But obviously the Austrians, and I like the point that George Selgin made about the mainstream is that when they argue against tariffs, they have in their mind what free trade is all about. But they are so intellectually impoverished that when they talk about money, they have a clue about what a free market in money would be all about. They actually have been imprinted, they have been indoctrinated in the idea that the central bank is what determines money. That kind of moronic lunacy. But my point is that the uncertainty principle of money and the demand for money to hold money balances, I think, is also a key insight. But to sum up, John, you and I are not that far apart in what we finally have said, because I think that you have said that the John Vallis portfolio would mostly be in a little bit of commercial paper and in a fair amount of stocks and bonds. You might invest in a startup in this world, but you'll keep a little bit, I'll use your term, a store of value in Bitcoin, a little bit of that. The mattress effect will still be true. And I'll basically concede that point. I think the mattress effect, as I prefer to call it, would be a healthy influence on the market. And I will say no more. You should have the last word, John. It's your show.
Well, I think that's a perfect summation of that particular point in this discussion.
Yeah.
And I would just add that, 35-year-old John Vallis would probably put a little bit more in your high risk, all those things, and maybe 70-year-old John Vallis would have a different approach. So this is the economic management, right, and financial management.
That's right.
So two more things, Gene, because I think we've maybe exhausted this one.
But our audience too.
I appreciate
your
your comments.
How many people are going to?
Gene, they're used to hearing me for 2 hours plus.
Well, obviously they can just sort of come back. They can listen. They can take it in 10-minute doses, people, because this has been we've solved almost all the intellectual problems of the economy, and so now John is going to have me solve the final two.
Yes, yes, and I will agree with you that I think it's absolutely insane that from middle school all the way up to university you can learn economics in all of its different permutations and never once discuss the money. The actual unit that all of this is transpiring in. It's insane. Okay, two more questions, Gene. So this is directly regarding Bitcoin. We've talked about the way that the market values scarcity. We understand the relationship between scarcity and money. We look at gold, we look at fiat currencies, we look at Bitcoin. You mentioned cryptocurrencies. Obviously, there's over 3,000 different cryptocurrencies today. You said that likely we will have a prime money or a single standard, and everything else will
overwhelmingly likely, unless the world is insane. We all want to use it as a medium of exchange. But go ahead,
which I totally agree with you on. My question is this, and this is something that I think might help people that aren't digital scarcity is a new thing for all of us, so we still need to wrap our heads around this. In the context of you could have an exact Bitcoin clone, right? The same technical scarcity, the same supply cap. What is it that upholds Bitcoin scarcity? And what is if we decide to move to another coin at any point in the future, do we totally unwind that ability to establish a scarcity that ultimately, in my opinion, and this is, I'd like to get your comment on this, is established socially, not technologically?
Wow. Okay, here's a question that even I might have to duck. When I heard that debated between Eric Voorhees and Peter Schiff, Voorhees was just making the point that there really are no clones to Bitcoin, and that it's like that there's the difficulty of of fraud, of branding, and I guess in a way I'm not being very articulate at all with my answer. I bow to you, John. You probably have an answer to that question. You're saying that there's no. You're saying the argument would be at its extreme that the idea that there was a Bitcoin with 21 million units limited is open to attack because somebody else can come along and say, I call this Bitcoin as well. Well, I do at least believe in the law of against fraud that it's fraudulent to call your currency Bitcoin if since that's not really Bitcoin, then you could bring a legal case. So that would be a matter of law. As far as I can understand it, for sure. But beyond that, Eric Voorhees was just responding by saying that, yeah, we've got all these cryptocurrencies, but you might as well just say that silver is a substitute for gold. And so that's my lame response. You must have a response. I'd love to hear from you about that, John, about that problem.
Sure, sure. Well, my opinion, my take on it currently is this, and that is that first of all, many of those clones exist. People, you just change one single attribute, and not that these things will be operating anonymously or in different jurisdictions. So the legal case is you can't really pursue. But in any case, you could just change a couple of small details. You could say my coin is going to be called, Pitcoin with a P, and it's going to have 20 million coins instead of 21 million, and that's better because ultimately it's more scarce. And so the question is,
that's fine.
Is what maintains Bitcoin's scarcity? And yes, you could say the network effect. It was established earlier, and it's had the chance for network effects to unfold. You could also say in that what we were talking about earlier about the relationship between cost and scarcity and the value attributed to something as a result of that is a factor. But what I think a lot of Bitcoiners realize is that digital scarcity may be just a genie that came out of the bottle, or sorry, it's a genie in a bottle, and if we ever let it out, we ruin it. For example, if we decide that there's another coin, couple little tweaks, it's better, it's got more bells and whistles, it's whatever. If we all decide to move over to that one, then we've kind of done away with the idea of digital scarcity, because then it's digital abundance. We can always just move to another one. Bitcoin's technical attributes permit us to uphold a scarcity. It's not scarce on its own, or at least that scarcity isn't relevant. The reason why it's relevant is because we all agree, as people that use Bitcoin, but more importantly, people that host nodes on the network that verify that a Bitcoin is a Bitcoin, collectively say, this is the one. This is the one true Bitcoin, let's say, and we are going to uphold this attribute of it because we realize the value of this attribute. And I'm referring to the scarcity. So if anybody were to ever try to change that, let's make it 200 million coins instead of 21 million coins, or let's move over to another coin. The socially upheld scarcity is the real important linchpin here, in my opinion, because it's not only technically derived.
I see.
Which is a bit squirrely for people, right? Because that's not the case with gold. Gold, you don't decide gold scarcity. It's in the ground in certain amounts. The market demands how much is being pulled out at any given point in time, right? But that's what it is. And maybe there's more in the ocean, maybe there's more in asteroids, but its scarcity is not socially dependent. It is, that the scarcity is what it is. Whereas,
okay, John. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, yeah. You want to finish your point? Okay.
Yeah.
I think I've got your point, John. I mean, this is important. It's important for me to respond because I do disagree with what you said, even though I'm a Bitcoin enthusiast. I do disagree. But you want to make a final point?
Well, and I don't think I've articulated this perfectly, but my final point is just that, with so many coins available, and with this idea of digital scarcity, because the technology can be replicated so easily, what's really important is that is the social component of the scarcity. And I guess what I'm introducing is the social component of scarcity. And I know that might even sound like an oxymoron or contradictory.
Well, no.
But this is, the scarcity element or attribute of Bitcoin is in its technological design in combination with how it's upheld socially, which is obviously different from something like gold that we used as sound money or hard money in the past, because its scarcity was, a truth of the universe. Let's say it didn't matter what we did with it. It had a certain amount in the earth or in the universe.
Okay, let me speak to your point, John.
Please.
I think it's an admirable statement you've made, but I do disagree. I think that my own vision is just as hopeful as yours. But even though I disagree, I mean, with these, maybe start this way. It is very possible that Bitcoin, if Bitcoin becomes money, then again, you seem to be granting my point that if fiat currency becomes unstable, if dollar becomes unstable, and if the renminbi of China becomes unstable, then there will be, on the part of us low IQ people, we will start to see the advantage of something that doesn't lose its purchasing power. And really, the loss of purchasing power is the reason why people vote for a currency, or the gain in purchasing power, the stability of purchasing power, which, of course, arises from scarcity. What I'm trying to say, though, is that the vast majority of people who use money don't understand the insight of scarcity, and they don't understand, of course, beyond that, why it's scarce. They only know that it's stable. They only know that what it could buy last year is more or less what it could buy this year, or indeed, in the case of Bitcoin, that it can even buy more. So purchasing power is really what motivates people to use money. And then, of course, the network effect of money, which is that naturally anybody is going to want to use the most popular money. And then, of course, the most popular money will be advertised. Look at all you can buy with it. This is what you want to hold. That competition will happen among cryptocurrencies. And my impression is that Bitcoin will win out, but maybe somebody knows better than I is going to say that Bitcoin will win out. But Bitcoin, for the moment, let's say it wins out. Beyond that, I think that the social belief in scarcity, this is unfortunately limited to the high IQ enthusiasts for Bitcoin. But what you mentioned in passing is really what I have to stress. What you mentioned in passing, which is the inertia of a network effect, the stability of a network effect, is really what will rule. By analogy, by the way, right now there's a powerful network effect with the dollar. The alternatives now are just not attractive. Bitcoin is not attractive enough in world markets. And so 90% of the transactions in the world market are not in euro. 90% of the transactions, the dollar is on the other side. The dollar is indeed the short pencil network effect currency of the world. And it's a very difficult situation to turn around because network effects tend to be stable. There tends to be a lot of inertia. If a couple of people try to introduce another currency as a store of value, that most people are comfortable using this one, other people use it. So the snowball of the network effect, I'm trying for a different metaphor, is very powerful. On the other hand, what will happen, however, is that if Bitcoin becomes money, then it will be very surprising if it doesn't remain money for years to come because of the power of the network effect. However, if Bitcoin comes along, and if Bitcoin is even better, then I could imagine Bitcoin being money for 50 years, for a century, for 30 years, because of the power of the network effect. But then the attractions of Bitcoin will be so great that it will eventually unseat Bitcoin. And so I'm not disturbed by that at all. All I'm saying is that we're dealing with just the likelihoods of human behavior. And the likelihood of human behavior is that once you start using a particular currency which is stable, you get in the habit of using it. And then again, I'm trying for a metaphor about the power of that chain, that everybody likes it. So there's this network and mob effect. That's very difficult to unsee. So sure. I'm not disturbed by your point.
Sure.
By the idea of a Bitcoin. Probably, if you and I at least understand innovation and the future, then maybe in the 22nd century there will be a Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And I should mention, I'm a little confused about what you said about gold, because again, the use of gold on the part of the hard money fanatics who store it and all the rest of it is really based upon the idea of its stability of purchasing power. That was the whole point. There was indeed in the 19th century, basically prices rose a little bit during wars, but by and large the power of the use of gold in that century was such that prices were stable. Prices should have fallen, by the way, so because there obviously was a lot of government meddling, but there was stability, and that's all people want is stability. Obviously they like appreciation on top of that, but certainly stability is important. So, but when I mentioned that gold was obviously at that stage of development the best kind of money, and Bitcoin is better, it's because there are of course so many gold people, like of course Peter Schiff, who still believe that gold is better than Bitcoin. But certainly when I ask them, what if there's a technological breakthrough and it suddenly costs practically nothing, if you'll go with my invention, to draw gold out of the sea? Then the temptation to do so, if you and I had a machine that could draw, we set up something by the seashore and we're drawing gold out of it, and gold is at $2,000 an ounce, and it costs us like a penny to mine an ounce, we're going to go nuts.
Right.
So the gold will no longer be money, and so gold is relative, but gold will no longer be money, not because people will necessarily know that the supply is increasing. They will just see that it's falling in value,
right.
And that its purchasing power is gone. But going back to the point, I'm betting on the stability. I cannot bet on your idea that there are enough people who have some sort of social cohesion.
That's not my idea, though. That's something. Let me clarify that one point.
Sorry.
When I talk about the social aspect of upholding Bitcoin scarcity, I'm talking about the nodes on the network which uphold the consensus rules by which Bitcoin is governed. So the nodes on the Bitcoin network are the ones of which there's tens, if not hundreds of thousands all around the world. They keep a copy of the entire ledger from the beginning, and they have all these little rules, these consensus rules that say if something basically comes across my desk and it meets this criteria, it's Bitcoin. If something comes across my desk and it doesn't meet this criteria or follow these rules, it's not Bitcoin and I reject it. When I say that Bitcoin scarcity is partially socially upheld, I'm referring to the nodes on the network who are obviously more informed than your average individual who's just transacting in the money because other people transact in the money.
Okay, John. The only thing that describes me a little bit, which I take, maybe you're not really intending to say, is that I would not want to think that this requires some kind of moral priesthood. I would want to think that there are positive, strong incentives to maintain this. No, they're just natural economic. We don't have to decide on the goodness of people. We just have to decide. We just have to bet on their obviously hopefully good intentions, not to be criminals, but more importantly, just their regard to their incentives. That there's an incentive effect. Is that what you're also saying with respect to these nodes?
Well, with respect to the nodes, there is no direct incentive. If you're not a mining node, right? So miners are the ones that obviously, devote the computing power to try to put their ticket in the lottery to try to get the newly minted coins. But as far as these nodes that I'm talking about that are non-mining nodes that simply uphold the consensus rules of the network and the entire copy of the ledger, there's no direct incentive other than the upholding the security of the network. And obviously if they hold the coins, then that's an incentive, but it's not a direct incentive to say that you get a fee or anything like that for hosting a node. In fact, it's a direct cost because you have to pay for the power and the hardware, etc.
But presumably it's just like you're part of this. This is the business you're in. So if you turn rogue and you do something to undermine it, then what would happen? Then what's the penalty? Can you imagine a rogue person running a node? Well, what's the worst case scenario you could imagine?
Well, basically, this is what happens when, new
Yeah.
coins emerge, when we
Yeah.
get what we call hard forks, and it's basically just members of that network saying, I want to run by different rules. I want to change the supply cap. I want to change the size of the blocks, this sort of thing.
Mhm.
And they say, so that's what I recognize as money now. And so they do
Mhm.
that, and that's why we've had these hard forks. And
Yeah.
so, but there's no, I mean, there's the incentive structure for the nodes is, and I wasn't, when I was saying that they uphold it, their incentive in my mind is that they are holders of the currency, and their work helps to keep that secure. But
It keeps them in business. They're incentive. They wanted this is a business. Go ahead. Yeah.
well,
Go ahead.
because
Yeah.
node operators typically aren't in business. They're
I know.
individuals like myself that will
Oh,
host a node at their home. They'll pay a few $100s for a piece of hardware, whatever energy is required to host a node. But they don't
I see.
receive any reward or any income for that. They're
No.
basic. They're basic, and I know this runs against the moral argument or incentive argument of Austrian economics and that sort of thought.
Well.
But
Well.
but what I'm just going to say is that their only real incentive, is basically to contribute to the security of the network in which they hold some of their capital. But the truth is
Okay.
is that in a context where there's hundreds of thousands of nodes all around the world, my node isn't providing really, any discernible added level of security. It's, because what's the difference between 100,000 and 110,000? Not
Mhm.
much in practice, but it is kind of this thing. And maybe this is a sign of the stage that Bitcoin is in, and maybe it will morph and change. But I'm sure you
Mhm.
know that
Mhm.
there is a lot of zealotry in Bitcoin, and there's a lot of people
Mhm.
that want so badly for this type of money to be used globally and to wrest the power of money creation from the state that they're willing to incur a certain cost in order to support this network. Now, again, they are
Mhm.
incentivized because all of them hold the coin. And so
Mhm.
if the network persists and it continues going up in value and it persists as a result of the security that they're adding to it, then they do gain. But it's not a direct incentive as in the traditional sense.
Okay, fair enough. No, I learned a lot. I'd have to put my mind around that. I guess I just want to try out on you the point that uh, if we can imagine a world again in which the trust in government fiat currency of any kind collapses, and then there is a suddenly enormous interest in cryptocurrencies, which would be, of course, evinced by a rising price of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies in relation to the dollar, in relation to the euro, in relation to the renminbi, the Chinese currency. If that were to happen, then there would indeed be competition to in terms of using which currency would be a medium of exchange. I think that could last a few years, but there will be hopefully a perception that once you advertise and the advertising will of course be in terms of the stability of your currency, and so there will be an incentive then to compete that way, and then I think there will be one or two currencies that one, let's just say one to make it simple, that one that will tend to be adopted and where the snowball effect will occur, but then beyond that, I take it you at least see my point that once a network is in place, it's very difficult to unseat it, and there's an incentive to maintain that stability because of the you're part of that network, you're part of it, but there's nothing wrong with other people coming up with your idea of Bitcoin and saying I've got another breakthrough, I've got something that works even better. Of course, obviously the Bitcoiners could maybe steal that idea. So I'm only saying that I do think that we can trust the stability of the network effects, so that what you were saying is the charge that it's going to be sort of like a chaotic competition, and where the money that every year or so there's going to be something happening to give us a new money. I think that's extremely unlikely, and I guess the reason why I'm not disquieted by saying, look, nothing is a lead pipe cinch, but then again, what's the alternative? The alternative is government fiat money, which is far messier, far riskier. That gets back to the same point that you and I should make, which is that we're not saying that markets don't fail. We're not saying that markets can ever even hope to operate perfectly. We're we're only saying that they're vastly better than the alternative, which is government domination. So that's what I would argue in the final analysis. But I'm only trying to get you to see that the power of the network effect will probably make a huge difference in terms of maintaining a stable currency for a while. But I can certainly envision the improvements every century, and maybe a new money adopted every century.
Absolutely. And no argument here from the network effect argument. Very familiar with that. And, and the Lindy effect as well, and in establishing it as a hard to unseat sort of currency. I maybe I didn't articulate it well, but my point was simply that in this new paradigm of the idea of digital scarcity, in which the technical attributes of any of these things can be copied, upgraded, changed, morphed, whatever. Notwithstanding that the network effect is a very significant moat around the first iteration or the earliest iteration, but just that the way that the nodes in the network operate is that scarcity is relevant in this environment, not because it's absolute, because it can be copied, right? But it's relevant because it's held up as such, and it's held up as such by the people in the network that are doing so. And my question in my mind that I still haven't squared is that this whole idea of digital scarcity, is it impinged, or is it infringed, or is it weakened if we move that upholding of scarcity around time and time again from one thing to the other, from one chain, from one coin to the other? Does that diminish it in any way? I don't know. Time will tell. Who knows?
Well, I'd have to bring you to the next level and point out that when you talk about these things, that's why I'm here. I'm 75 years old. I'm talking about the 22nd century. I'm jumping ahead 100 years. Where I'll be 175 then, John, and you'll be 135, and hopefully we'll still be talking. On the other hand, if the immortality promise doesn't come through, then you have to worry about your children and the generations after. And I'm intrigued by what you say, and I'm only learning from it. But obviously it doesn't just mean the current generation of people who run the nodes. It means future generations, because I do think that it would have to last for decades, and so that's part of the issue as well. That's all.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that the lack of, in the future, when the holding coins is nets smaller returns, let's say, when it's monetized, it'd be interesting to see how incentives or lack thereof, as being a node operator, influence people's desire to be a node operator and incur that cost, and what impact that has on the security of the network. Those are some interesting unanswered questions that we're definitely going to find out.
I guess my final statement is that you would say, do you have another question? Oh, did you have something else to say?
I was going to say, Gene, in the interest of not speaking until we're 175 years old, I was going to hit you with my last couple of rapid fires. But go ahead and give me what you were going to say.
No. My point was it's just I want to set for the Bitcoin enthusiast. As I said, part of my theme has just been think about Bitcoin for the 80 IQ people, for the 90 IQ people, the people who just live day to day. As I say, the visceral fact of purchasing power, that it could buy something yesterday, that's the reality for them. As Safi Amos said, some people might prefer physical Bitcoin. I mean, the point is the market will respond to needs, and a lot of people who understand how ordinary people work and the quirks of ordinary people, that's going to be an important element in the development of Bitcoin. But go ahead.
So Gene, this is the very last part, and then we'll shut it down. And only if you're open to it, of course. But the last part that I usually do,
I will.
Well, it's a word association. So I'll stream out about 15 words, and you just tell me the first thing that pops into your mind when I say these words.
Of course.
Okay. The first one is democracy.
Democracy sucks.
The corporation.
I have to do a statement.
You're breaking the rules, Gene.
It has to be one word. One word.
Well, a short phrase. Go for it. Tell me what you want to say.
Corporation. One mode of production among many under capitalism.
Human rights.
Human rights is certainly properly defined essential to libertarians. Human rights.
Choice,
certainly properly defined, essential to the free market. Yeah.
Violence.
Violence, hopefully, it will diminish in a market society. It generally does because it enhances cooperation.
Ego.
Ego. Some people, a lot of people do things out of ego. Many people do things just out of love of humankind. Yeah.
Consensus, as in agreement amongst parties.
Voluntary consensus is always good. Politically imposed consensus is bad.
Wealth.
Uh, Material wealth is great. If you have four grandchildren like I have, you also have a kind of a human wealth that is deeply satisfying.
Privacy.
Privacy essential, an essential right on a free market. Yeah.
Hate speech.
Hate speech is fine. Let's counter it with the speech of love.
Gold.
Gold. Gold. Okay. Gold. As I've said, it's relatively scarce because it's expensive to mine, but that could change.
Guns.
Guns. Guns are important to a lot of people. Guns are a great leveler, and that's what they've been. Guns are a great leveler between the people who are weak versus people who are strong physically. Yeah.
Revolution.
Revolution, nonviolent revolution is the best way to go because that nonviolent revolution is always possible.
Socialism.
Socialism. Okay. It's unfortunately the way it's conventionally defined. It's unfortunately going to strangle freedom and prosperity.
Family.
Family is a choice, and a choice that many of us are very wise to make.
Inequality.
Inequality. I'm completely indifferent to inequality. I want as many billionaires as possible who've made that billion legitimately on the free market.
Hell.
Hell. Hell. Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Hell. Well, hell. Well, unfortunately, there are too many governments make a hell on earth, and to this day, they're continuing to make a hell on earth, and we have to fight that.
Liberty.
Liberty, freedom, and the most heartening thing about human history is that the love of liberty seems to increase every century.
Energy.
Energy. Well, the energy that's currently manifested in fossil fuels is essential to lifting the living standards of the broad masses of people.
And last one, Bitcoin.
Bitcoin, a very legitimate hope of the future. If it can appreciate 1,000 times in value, which is very possible, and if there's a even just a 1% chance that it can appreciate 1,000 times in value, that's one chance out of 100 of 1,000 times your money. So it's a very good bet.
Gene, this has been a very stimulating conversation. I very much appreciate you taking the time on your Saturday morning. But before we go, Gene, is there anywhere you wanted to direct people to your Twitter or the Soho debates or anything like that?
Well, I'd love people from Newfoundland, and of course you're probably being listened to all over the world. Go into thesohoforum.org, thesohoforum.org, to access all of the debates we've held, including the one on socialism that I recently did, which has had now over 200,000 views on YouTube. And then come to New York. If you say the words Tom Woods to me, if you come to New York and you attend our debates, then the free drink at the bar. I will be debating Steve Moore, who has been an advisor of the Trump administration on Trump's tariff policies, in February, and we're going to have a debate on robotics in January. Look at our schedule, soulform.org. We've got 8 debates scheduled between now and July, so please come.
Very interesting. Well, Gene, thank you again for taking the time. This was super fun, and maybe someday we'll do it again, either another one of these Skype calls or face-to-face sometime.
Absolutely. I look forward to it.
Thanks so much, Gene.
Sure.